Good morning, everyone. My name is Mark Canavera. I'm the Associate Director of the CPC Learning Network. We are delighted that there is such interest today in this webinar that the CPC Learning Network is hosting on integrating early childhood development and violence prevention. We're very lucky to have with us today Dr. Cassie Landers, who is an affiliate of the CPC Learning Network, but very accomplished in many other ways as well. Dr. Landers holds a doctorate in education as well as a master's in public health from Harvard University. She has worked with UNICEF and a number of other international agencies for close to 20 years to promote policies and programs in support of young children and families. She's provided technical assistance and support to child development programs in over 60 countries. And just think of that number, it's so high, in Southern Africa, South Asia, East Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa, as well as Central Asia and Eastern Europe. She has extensive experience in the design, implementation, and training of practitioners at all levels, developing a wide variety of interventions that range from developmental pediatrics to parenting education. Dr. Landers also has her foot in the child protection in emergencies world and the early childhood in emergencies world, having participated in rapid assessment missions in areas of conflict, including Liberia, East Timor, Iraq, Afghanistan, Kosovo, and Romania, and has designed interventions for children in conflict and post-conflict situations. She has also worked with the Head Start National Literacy Center, bringing her international expertise to young children and families in the United States. In addition to her work at Columbia and as a faculty affiliate of the CPC Learning Network, she is an associate of Maestral International, a technical consultant for Head Start, an affiliate of Brock University in Bangladesh, and an affiliate was a visiting international faculty member at the Moscow School of Social and Economic Studies in Moscow, Russia. So someone with just such a wide variety of expertise who has brought her many skills to bear on this question of how we can better integrate early childhood development and violence prevention. I'm sure that you're all very excited to help me join in welcoming Dr. Landers. A few notes about participation in this webinar. It will be recorded. So if you have colleagues who aren't able to join us this morning or this evening, depending on where you are in the world, they will be able to watch the webinar on the CPC YouTube channel in the near future. Also, if you have questions, you should be seeing a little chat box on your screen, and type them there, and the webinar organizers will bring them to Dr. Landers in the Q&A period in the second half of the webinar. Thanks very much, and over to you, Cassie.
Okay, Mark, thank you very much for that very thoughtful and kind introduction, and I'm sorry that it took so much of our time, but anyway, I appreciate the opportunity to be with all of you and thank the CPC Network for organizing this webinar. My only disappointment is that we're not all in the same room where I can actually see your faces, and perhaps there's some familiar faces that I would recognize. But as Mark indicated, this is an initiative or a project that was funded by the UBS Optimist Foundation together with the Global Alliance for Children, and it was a great privilege to have the opportunity to take a very broad look, a landscape analysis. I had a very specific focus, which was not necessarily looking at specific programs and analyzing evidence-based practices, etc. That work is going on by other members of the consortium, including WHO and UNICEF. But this initiative was more focused on taking a very broad look to seeing what's happening in terms of the integration of these two fields within networks, campaigns, what are some of the ongoing and exciting initiatives, and basically trying to highlight what could be the exciting opportunities for looking across these two fields and coming up with a shared agenda. So this morning I will be focusing really on some of the findings from that analysis and trying to highlight for us some exciting areas where we can begin to collaborate and work together. But not knowing the background of the audience, instead of just jumping quickly into the findings from the analysis, I thought we'd just highlight some of the reasons why this is a very ideal time and an exciting time to begin to look across these various two fields. The first and perhaps the most important, because in the area of early child development, we've gotten a tremendous amount of recent research looking at the range of risk and protective factors in early child development. And when you look at these factors, they are the very same risk and protective factors that are analyzed and looked at and studied in violence prevention work. We also know that many children around the world are not reaching their early child developmental outcomes. And as well, we know the prevalence of violence against children is dramatic. And both these two fields are interrelated. So poor early child development outcomes lead to greater incidence of violence, and violence against young children leads to poor child development outcomes. There's also a very significant overlap between the prevention strategies, looking at what the violence against children tries to accomplish in terms of its strategies. And the same looking at early child development, there are very similar sectors, there are similar parties, they're similar experts, and yet up until this point, there's been a lot of not a lot of interaction between these different silos. So the large-scale programs, as I indicated, also involve the same sectors, stakeholders, and professional expertise. Just again, I'm sure most of you are very much aware of the indications of why this is such a pervasive human right and why it is such a challenge. And again, I'd like to preface my remarks here by saying that this is one of the greatest problems, is that we really don't have a very strong handle on the scale, the size, and the scope of the problem. But even the little bit of information that we have underscores the tremendous need. And what I think many fail to recognize is that most of the abuse of young children occurs within families. Abuse of young children is not limited by geography, ethnicity, or social status. And this prevalence is dramatically underreported both in across the world, not only in low-income countries, but in high-income countries as well. We're also learning the tremendous impact of the impact on children's development, not just the victims of abuse, but the exposure. So just the being exposed to abuse within the family has also negative impacts on children's development. And children under 5 are at greatest risk. Some of the data is really quite dramatic. Children under 5, even under 3 years of age, are at the greatest risk for severe injury and the long-term developmental consequences on both health and social, emotional, and cognitive development. And then this is a pervasive problem, which is the social and cultural norms and the tolerance towards domestic violence. So much of what we understand about the abuse of young children under the age of 5 is very much hidden to both programmers and policymakers. Those of you who have been looking at this area are probably very familiar with what has been a very exciting and prolific trend within the last decade or so, which is the impact of violence, abuse, and neglect on children's development and what we can understand due to its impact on the developing brain. We now know, and I won't go into detail of this because perhaps most of you have access to this information, but if you don't, I would like to suggest that you look at the Center for the Developing Child at Harvard University, from which this information on this slide is taken, but they have a range of social policy briefs, which are very easy to understand, as well as more complicated academic articles that talk about the impact of violence on the child's development. Basically, I think what has been most powerful as there has been their categorization of stress. We know that Dr. Shonkoff's work has suggested that there are three levels of stress. Positive stress is perhaps what those of us organizing this webinar felt this morning, which is just a normal part of development. It actually is what pushes us along the developmental trajectory, overcoming certain challenges, such as your first day at school as a young child, are very positive sources of stress. There's a whole range of stress which is known as tolerable. Those are perhaps exposure to loss of a parent, loss interaction with some sort of natural disaster. But the interesting thing here for young children is this type of stress can be buffered by carrying adult responses. And this is the kind of things that we do see across the board when there is a supportive community around children who are experiencing stress. But it's this third one that I think, which is toxic stress, which is strong, prolonged, and frequent. And now we know that it releases excessive cortisol, which actually disrupts the architecture of the brain during these very sensitive periods. And this is, again, just a slide from one of the background documents from the Center for Developing Child that just uses brain scans to show that the brain's activity can be measured in electrical impulses. Here we're seeing that these hot colors, or the orange colors, indicate more activity. Each of these three columns shows a different kind of brain activity, so they may be thinking skills or cognitive skills, self-regulation, social and emotional development. These are different parts of the brain, but you can see that those children who are institutionalized do not show up on these brain scans of the hot or the actually active areas of the brain showing increasing activity. So this is just one of the many examples we have now, and growing examples of what the stress does, what this prolonged and toxic stress, such as children who are living in environments of extreme abuse and neglect. This is what's happening to this architecture of the brain, which, as we know now, has long-term developmental consequences. This is a slide that I think so nicely illustrates what we're all trying to do, both the child protection field and in the area of early child development, is, as that earlier slide indicated, we're both struggling with this to increase the number of protective factors and decrease the number of risk factors. But what you can see here is that in early childhood and at birth, even if there are the number of risk factors are greater than the number of protective factors, with high quality intervention programs during sensitive periods, you can actually increase that child's trajectory so that it almost approaches the optimum amount of child development. That becomes much more difficult, as you can see, during middle childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. Even though the brain and one is always able to change, it's this very sensitive period in early childhood where the development is so rapid that if we can increase through our programs and strategies ways to build up and strengthen the protective factors within families. So that's just a little. I'm going to try to look at my time here, where I have a fancy screen that tells me how long I've been talking so far. But anyway, I wanted to just give a little bit of a background as to why I find that this is such an exciting time to be looking across these two fields and coming up with some shared frameworks for action. So as I indicated earlier, the goal of my review, which was just recently completed and presented in September, at a meeting of the Child Preventions of Child Violence group in Oxford, England. So as I said, it was to review these areas of networks, campaigns, to highlight gaps and challenges and identify emerging opportunities. And I had two methods, both which were incomplete, I must say, and but I think highlighted some interesting areas. I interviewed about 25 different key representatives from the field who are either working in NGOs, UN agencies, foundations, to really have a sense of what their work is focusing on, what do they see as the trends and the challenges that are inherent. and the frustrations that are inherent in their current look and activities towards prevention of violence in young children. Then I also did a systematic review of published reports and publications, trying to find those that are some exciting interventions as well as those that are more evidence-based practices. So this is a summary, and I'm sure Mark will make it available to you, and if you have any problems accessing the original paper, this is just a summary of some of the trends, and I'd have to say that overall, even though the initial part of the conversations with these 25 experts did focus on challenges, there was an equal amount of energy and optimism as to how we can move forward. There is great recognition across all interviewees that this patchwork, piecemeal approach has been working against us. It's working against all of us. Interesting from the child protection field, while there is a great acceptance of the life cycle approach, but there's been up to this point relatively little attention to child protection concerns within the first 5 years. And here perhaps I may emphasize that those of you know that there's perhaps some agencies and frameworks look at child development or early childhood all the way up to age 8. Others, perhaps those looking more from the health field, look at the first 5 years. The early childhood field usually looks through up to age 8 just because of the high risk at that transition from primary school or from the family, for the transition from preschool into primary school, which is a very high risk area for many young children and their families, and also trying to bring attention to the linkages between early childhood and the tremendous need for quality education and a child-friendly approach, particularly in first and second grade. There's recognitions of, because integrated early child development programs across sectors, there's many challenges of implementing, sustaining, and scaling the programs and keeping them at their level of quality. Both fields of child violence against children and early childhood have been suffering from an absence of agreed upon ways to measure outcomes, although both, I think, are making progress in that. This is an interesting one for me, sitting at Columbia School of Public Health, but there does seem to be a movement towards a public health framework which is moving away from a focus on services towards individual families and children and really looking at what communities, social and cultural, much broader framework moving towards. Perhaps one interviewee made comparisons between approaches to looking at the public health way of prevention of childhood obesity rather than focusing on individual children, but looking at school systems and communities, the marketing of food towards children. And I think it's within that much broader framework that we're beginning to see opportunities for the prevention of abuse and neglect of young children. Some of the interviewees mentioned the notion of using communities as the champions of social change and moving and looking at what we can do to build up the informal systems which exist and are oftentimes not seen as perhaps the strength of positive methods towards preventing child abuse and neglect. And this perhaps is another one that's very interesting, is again, what can we do not to target individual families that are at risk, but really create systems that see all families with young children in need of information and services, and mechanisms that can then therefore connect families at greater need and at higher need to more intensive services. When I asked the respondents what would be the, looking 5 years from now, what would they be able to capture as measures of success? And basically I thought this was quite a lot of agreement as to what was needed. The first one, of course, is this notion of measurable targets, global agreement of key indicators that governments can have acceptance and a recognition of, but also at the same time that these tools and measures be available to field workers so that they can also have access to simple tools and measures so that they can enhance the quality of their services that they are providing. there seems to be very much of this need and this push to move from small-scale programs to those that are we need to get much faster. We need to accelerate our movement at country level, looking at the replication at both within countries and between countries within regions, underlying our core components of our success and building on the capacity of systems around these programs to provide and support the programs. So that's the replication and scaling up of the smaller demonstration programs, of which I must say we have a tremendous amount in the field of early childhood, exciting examples that have never quite found the way to move to scale. There's also been very much what would be helpful to all of us is a global platform where we can have a community of innovators, where we can bring new technologies and drivers of change and innovation, where we have new leadership which is able to recognize the synergies that are gained from working across disciplines, approaches to child-friendly community development, and a dynamic platform where we can begin to share the expertise that is rapidly developing. And then there is this one which I thought was actually quite interesting. During my interviews, it's the first time I had actually heard this term, but this notion that the child protection, this sense of well-being, should be this third sphere of what we're trying to do as a community of innovators, alongside health, education, child protection, and well-being. And the program's success should be driving the government commitment, trying to align government and NGO strategies, giving us a sense of the cost and replication of scaling up, and providing opportunities to stimulate public-private partnerships. So this is sort of the roadmap or the benchmarks of success if we look towards 2020, which is rapidly approaching. But I thought this was a very exciting way from across the 25 interviewees to see that there was such consistency in what would be our measures of success as we move forward. So getting now down to a little bit more of the detail of perhaps some of the landscape that I looked at. Basically, I started with trying to make a distinction between campaigns and movements, and I'm sure this will be one of the questions for further discussion, if not on this webinar, but as we move forward. But the number of violence prevention campaigns and movements, both at the national level, regional level, and international level, was mind-boggling, particularly for me, who had not necessarily been keeping up to date with the tremendous push towards the campaigns. But what I did find surprising and somewhat discouraging, but yet at the same time behind a finding like this is great opportunity. There was very little within the existing movements and campaigns that focused on the very vulnerable young children. Many of the campaigns did target a specific vulnerable group, whether they were girls, young adolescent mothers, the gender issue, families experiencing extreme neglect, marginalized families or marginalized groups, but very much little attention to children in our youngest age. And yet we know that the extent of the problem is dramatic for this age group. And again, very little understanding of the causes, consequences, and the impact on young children. But herein lies what I find an extremely not only creative, challenging, but also very possible, given the extent of the scientific background that we have now, the scientific data, is an opportunity to recast the narrative, not to be victimizing the victims, not to be focusing on the scare and the necessarily the impact, but to focus much more on what can be done. the notion of engaging communities in their own solutions, identifying and highlighting solutions that we know are driving success. So we're actually bringing in the community and in the families to be part of the solution. I think the work that Dr. Shonkoff has done has also very much created this story of child development, and the story of child development talks about the tremendous possibility for simple routines, simple interactions between caregivers, caring caregivers, not necessarily the family members, but supportive interactions known as a serve and return, all of these things that can buffer the stresses that children and families feel. So again, it's using the information that we know about child development to put solutions back into the hands of families. I think we also, and I was very impressed by many of the examples of some of the exciting technologies that we have available to us now, and the use of them, not necessarily in this area, but we can build on what's been happening to disseminate some of this knowledge that we have in some exciting ways. This is also an area that what I actually found, those of us, probably many of you in the audience are also representing some of these networks. But there is a plethora of networks out there, and again, on many different levels. We have some that are at the national level, regional level, some interesting ones that are grassroots, moving from the focus of parents and communities creating their own networks to address some of these programs. But again, here if we look at perhaps the one that I know the best, which is the Consultative Group on Early Childhood Care and Development, they've spent a great deal of attention looking at how they should structure their work. And so those of you who know about that would look at interventions for 0 to 3, interventions for 3 to 5, children ages 3 to 5, 6 to 8, all this covered by policy development, but very, very little looking at violence against young children. The same is true when we look at the range of the child protection networks that are out there. There is a much greater space and that needs to be filled with information relevant to the impact on violence against young children within the existing networks. So I think herein lies a very exciting possibility to create I'm calling these specific packages of information. So for example, if there is a network that's specifically focusing on evaluation of interventions, we can create a package of information that would highlight specific strategies, frameworks, and tools for evaluating programs that look at young children and prevention of abuse. I think there's also another opportunity to create sets of advocacy materials. What are the key messages that we know will be working to raise attention, but also what is the diverse audiences that we need to respond to, and how would our materials and our technical guidelines respond to the different audiences that we're trying to reach. So this is perhaps on a global level, also regional level and national level, but I think there's a great deal of technical assistance that can be provided in the development of these materials. I'm looking at my time here, 33 minutes and 19 seconds I have been speaking. But when I then moved to this third whole area of what I was calling or trying to identify would be the exploration of initiatives and new initiatives that are being promoted by a whole range of different organizations. And here I clustered the findings into these 7 different types of interventions. And the first one, again, I'm sure is not unknown to many of you and in your work, but I found what was very striking to me as this seemed to be the strategy that cut across all sectors. And we are we have a tremendous amount and a growing amount of information behind parenting education strategies in terms of what works, what are some of the challenges, what are some of the different models, and there are many variety of models, standalone models, those that are integrated into existing programs, programs that are available to all parents and families versus those that are specifically targeted. But even within these parenting education programs, I'd have to say that few of them look specifically at the impact on violence reduction. So while there's a tremendous amount of work being done there, I think we have an opportunity for linkages here again, more specifically looking at the impact of parenting education on reduction of violence against young children. Coming from a public health perspective, I have always in my last 20 years of work in this area been very excited by the possibilities of linking information to health and nutrition services. Maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, this was a little bit more challenging, but now the opportunities, the interest from everything from the American Academy of Pediatrics to pediatricians studying at BRAC School of Public Health in Bangladesh, there is this recognition that the families in which they're servicing have questions and need access to the kinds of child development information and parenting services, and the interaction again between what we now know between stimulation and nutrition. So there's much greater opportunity now for linkages with child development, positive parenting interactions and strategies. Oftentimes, there may not in many countries be the capacity for the parenting education, which is often within the Ministry of Education. So there's an opportunity to reach greater number of children and families through the existing health and nutrition services. The early learning programs is, again, there's some very exciting work where as the number of children being exposed to or having some time in community or formal community-based or formal preschools, having greater opportunities for using these as safe spaces for children who may be at risk. This is a very natural linkages, I think, between the two systems. Also, it provides an opportunity for increasing those protective family factors that we mentioned at the beginning of the talk. If the early learning programs can not only be focusing on what's can happen, which is just a focus on school readiness, but really be fostering linkages with families, creating opportunities for social support amongst the families whose children are attending these. So there's a great opportunity here, but therein also lies challenges with providing the kinds of training that our early learning care providers need in order to recognize children who are experiencing perhaps neglect and how they can begin to support families. These multi-sector integrated strategies as a whole other area, very exciting work. This really reflects some of the work going on in Latin America and some exciting work now in Africa, where it's not looking at a district or a community, but really coming up with a national strategy, a national integrated strategy that works across health, education, nutrition, and child protection, which is looking at policy structures and systems that need to ensure that these are programs that are available on a national level. There's some very exciting work going on there. I mentioned before the use of webcast media, mobile technologies that can be supportive of us, some very exciting interactive websites which are focusing again more on these positive messages and solutions. This last one, or the second to last one on capacity development, is also a tremendous amount of potential and also pockets of very exciting work. Here I'm referring to those efforts where there's efforts to build early childhood development capacity at the national regional level, but again focusing on what can we do to the emerging leaders that gives them the skills and capacities to work, to feel comfortable, to work across disciplines, to see synergies, and to give them the skills for forging ahead by moving out of silos and looking more to integrated strategies. We can take some of these methods and instructions on program design and development, and integrate these packages both into early child development um, programs, but also into schools of social work, schools of public health, so that we raise the attention of the emerging leaders towards what can be done in this very critical, sensitive period of early childhood. This last one, perhaps Mark needs a whole new webinar, but there is the recognition that we need tools and measures that are agreed upon across agencies and that can be utilized across countries and regions. UNESCO, WHO, UNICEF, I know Save the Children are developing and working on some of these exciting measures, and we can perhaps explore that a little bit further in some future work. But that's a whole other area where I think we are making tremendous progress. So I will just summarize by these final two slides, and just by saying the 5 summary points, which try to bring together and create what I feel is optimism and excitement by bringing together these two very powerful fields of violence against children and early ECD, which is this notion of engaging families with young children through multiple entry points. I know it's often that we have the problem of working within silos, but it's really a much more powerful way to look at this field is if we recognize the multiple entry points and the synergy between these entry points. Some of the entry points are more effective if you're looking at a very young child between pregnant before birth and up to the first year or two. But what can we do to create these synergies and linkages between these multiple entry points? But I think that the point is to use them, and to use them in countries wherever you find the greatest strength of an existing entry point and the greatest interest into developing this sector. So the knowledge dissemination, a huge challenge here to build on and existing advocate networks and campaigns and movements. Here I would not advocate for creating anything new, but just for supporting and building on what we already have. Developing the young leaders, looking towards the future, and this notion, which perhaps was behind this whole exercise, was to look at the balance between what many of us are charged with of scrutinizing and replicating and understanding evidence-based programs, but not leaving out space for creativity and innovation. As one of the leaders in this field has said, we need to raise our bar higher. Even in our evidence-based programs, I think those of us who recognize the challenge of measuring don't feel satisfied with the impacts that we're finding. And so I think we can't, while we have to have a balance between evidence-based, I think we need to create space and potential for creativity and not to be afraid to fail. Because perhaps even in my own experience, the greatest lessons are those that I've learned from interventions where it didn't work, but yet you take what didn't work and you continue to build on that and link that information into the interventions that seem to be more successful. This fourth one I hadn't mentioned before, but actually reflects some of the work that, thank you Mark for recognizing Maestro, but I was participating on the development of a toolkit that tried to map child protection systems, and it was there that I and my colleagues recognized that we had very little looking at the mapping of the early childhood system. So one of the things that perhaps we can look at together is a strategy or set of tools and methods that try to look both at the early childhood system and the child protection system in a way that can look at the strengths and responsibilities of ministries and the way that we can enhance collaboration and linkages. And then finally is this notion of building and sustaining a dynamic global learning platform where those of us, whether we're representing funders or implementers or policymakers or evaluators, can find an exciting and comfortable place to share both our successes and our I wouldn't call them failures, but things that are challenging us. And just to close, which with a quote from an article that appeared. It's actually called a public health approach to prevention of child abuse and neglect from a pediatrician here in the U.S. But I think it very beautifully summarizes the direction in which we're all trying to imagine communities that provide strength and compassion for our youngest children. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm sorry if I talked over. If I could see your faces, I perhaps would have scooted more quickly through my slides, but I think, Mark, maybe we have a little bit of time for some questions and clarifications.
We definitely do. Thank you so much, Cassie. And you spoke for 36 minutes, and that's, I think, it's a perfect amount of time.
Not so bad. I'm usually a little worse than that, but I'm glad to hear that. Thank you.
This quote is a beautiful one, and I think reading it, I think both the ECD worlds and the child protection worlds can see themselves in it, and that's a very clear message, I think, to all of us. Cassie, that was a great presentation, and we've gotten several notes from around the world saying, how useful it is to be considering these issues in conjunction and not in parallel. And we do have some first questions from participants and attendees of the webinar. One is this. What are some of the institutional blockages between collaboration? So why I read that to mean, why have these two areas of work developed in isolation, and what barriers could be removed to ease collaboration? A question that I myself wanted to add was this. If you had to pick, you gave us quite a bit of rich food for thought on how we could move forward. If you had to pick one priority action for the very immediate future, what would that one be? What's the easiest thing that we could do that would get us moving together effectively? When I look at the list of options that you presented or areas for exploration, the one that I jumped on, not just because it's the first bullet point, but because it's where I see so much movement in the child protection world right now. It's the parenting programming. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious if you have thoughts on what the early priorities should be. And then a third question that I think is linked is, as you undertook this landscape analysis, what did you learn about child carers and other forms of caregivers than parents regarding training and violence prevention, as they are often the ones caring for children? Child minders is the word that Noreen used, given that many children are being taken care of by people other than their parents. Back over to you, Cassie.
Oh, thank you, Mark. Barriers to collaboration. I guess perhaps everyone attending this webinar could answer that question from your own perspective and your own observations. And perhaps maybe I'll just highlight a few. I think to a large extent, sometimes this is driven by funding mechanisms, particularly in the larger organizations where budgets are allocated according to sectors. And this has been something that child development has struggled with for a very, very long time because it does cross sectors. So I remember my early days of going through UNICEF annual country reports, even though looking through them I could see indications of where child development sat in many of the different sectors, it was often not highlighted at all because it was embedded within. So I think that is the notion of people recognizing the importance of early child development, but yet not knowing how to design it, how to plan for it, how to budget it, and how basically to work across sectors. I think that changed a little bit when this whole field of early learning became so powerful, and so there was this focus more on looking at that 3 to 5 age group with very much more from an educational point of view, looking at what can we do to prepare children from the early learning perspective before they enter school. So I think it's often largely driven by a funding perspective. It's also driven by expertise. People who are early learning specialists may have not had the opportunity to link together with nutritionists and see how their perspective on child development could be useful to a nutritionist because their training has been so much focused within their own silo. They may or may not have the skills to communicate or the opportunities to do so. Um, I think one of the organizations where I was speaking to, I spoke in organizations both to child protection sectors as well as to early childhood. And it was surprising to note that oftentimes even within the same organization, there was not the recognition of development of perhaps tools or methodologies. Sometimes the whole prevention of prevention of abuse and neglect may be called in one particular fora peace education. So that seems to go down the education route, which is not necessarily looking at the language that a child protection may use. So I think there's a language problem, there's a training problem, there's a funding problem, and there's a measurement problem, lack of shared measurement tools that can actually help us see what it is that we're trying to measure and how these tools actually can be the same tools that we could use across. Mark, should I keep going to answer the 4 questions?
Sorry, I was unmuting myself.
Oh, sorry, Mark.
I would go ahead. We've got quite a few more, but while you're doing that, I'll be regrouping them into
Okay. All right.
Take a few more minutes.
So one priority action. That's a really hard one for me to answer, and perhaps I'm so committed to all of them but leading to your next question, Mark, perhaps I'll answer it this way. I have spent perhaps the last maybe 10 or 15 years focusing on parenting programs. It was actually one of the first things that I started doing as a very young actor in this field, which was trying to come up with a little animated series of key concepts that all parents should have access to, very much along the lines of a Facts for Life idea of what if you only had 10 messages could you focus on regarding child's development. And the goal of this information was not to be seen as a standalone parenting, but to be able to give this kind of information to healthcare providers, to nutritionists, to community organizers, to religious leaders, any of those key informants that had opportunities to meet with families. So I do feel that perhaps this notion of parenting education, oftentimes we perhaps even need to come up with a better calling of it besides parenting education, because I think one of the things that we've learned is the parents have tremendous amounts of strengths. Sometimes it's not going in with a deficit model to fill gaps of what parents don't know, but to actually start with building upon family strengths, community strengths, and then inserting some of this new information that's been developing so rapidly, giving all parents access to some of this scientific basis for why what they are doing is so critical. So I would say, Mark, that the parenting education strategy is a cross-cutting theme. We have emergence of knowledge about what is the appropriate dose, what's the kinds of way you package these. One of the key learnings for me in this whole area is that knowledge is not enough. So it's not just enough to have groups of parents on a 10-week session where they attend a number of different topics. What parents really need is skills-based training. So if in our thinking about parenting education programs, we can also find ways for them to come together as groups to practice the skills that they're learning. Some very interesting information regarding what we're seeing as so critical in child development is self-regulation. But the exciting thing about that is self-regulation is one of those skills that develops all throughout adulthood. And there's an opportunity to not only increase the child's capacity for self-regulation, but at the same time try to give the parents themselves skills for increasing their own ability to respond to their children's behavior, but also ways that they organize their own day-by-day routine. So I do think parenting programs in all its variety of forms and with its many actors could be an area that we focus on. The fourth point that you raise, the caregivers or childminders, which again, each country, each program has their way of codifying those. I suspect the thing that we have learned is that it doesn't have to be effective in this field just for the caregivers does not require extensive BA degrees or fancy training, but what it does require is quality, ongoing training that is well thought out, that's not just a one-shot type of training, but that is a mentoring process where there's also capacity for child caregivers to feel that they have some support, that they're part of have some supervision support, that there's a place where they can go to address some of the problems that they're finding. So better systems of training, ongoing training, and mentoring, creating within communities, small-scale pilot training centers where one of the greatest problems across the field of early childhood is a tremendous amount of burnout, and the child providers often don't stay as soon as they have an opportunity to move perhaps into primary education. So there's a whole range of exciting things that we've been doing also in this country to look at how we can increase the professionalization of early childhood providers, recognition their status within the field of education and child development, and exciting ways to provide them with ongoing access to information, skills, and tools. So I guess therein also lies a challenge, and a point of action is really trying to focus on exciting ways, perhaps using some of these new technologies to enhance the training that the child care providers working in many different sectors receive.
Thank you, Cassie. We have a host of other questions here that people are very, very interested in this topic. It's obvious. Terry Laura has asked if the slides will be available, and the answer is yes, Terry. We will have them up soon on the CPC Learning Network webpage on a page that will also include this webinar itself, which will be on the YouTube channel and then embedded on the CPC's website. Excuse me, the report is already available there. Cassie, you have quite a few fans. Somebody tells you, this is, I believe, Jane from Uganda, that you have a very soothing voice and you should make meditation tapes.
Well, oftentimes people do ask me if I'm an early childhood specialist by my voice. I don't know if it's something that it sort of binds us all together, but thank you, Jane.
We have quite a bit of validation for what you're saying from Lynn Jones, who says that she agrees with your analysis that funding is driving a lot of these splits. She says that she finds that education is often more interested in 3 to 8-year-olds. Health is more interested in under 3-year-olds with more nutrition and health. And understandably, education has its age groups rather than looking across the whole period. But as you said, all of them tend to leave out child protection, and particularly those working with under 5-year-olds. Lynn adds that peace education programs often don't address punitive physical violence. And following on to her earlier comment, she's concerned at the split within the early childhood development world between education and health. There are kind of two groups of questions that I'm going to pose to you here, Cassie. One is about the coordination, and this is building on a couple of questions. One comes from Wendy Smith, who
Mm-hmm.
asks, in the absence of coordinated ministries, with whom and how should we coordinate on violence prevention? Community-based health workers are overburdened, and community-based protection systems are under-supported. Ministries of education often do not feel responsible for these questions. Is the answer a network of community members, volunteers, and parents? How can we foster this so that it's sustained moving forward? So that is, at community level,
Mm-hmm.
how would coordination happen? A number of the questions also looked at tools and approaches. Carolyn Bishop asks if you came across any ECD curricula that you felt effectively included violence prevention. We would love to build upon what already exists rather than reinventing the wheel. We've also gotten a request for your 10 key messages for parents from your parenting education program, which we'll get from you and put on the same webpage that we put these presentations on. 3 more questions about tools here, and I do apologize if this seems that it's overwhelming, so you can regroup and answer as you feel fit. That's B. Boutron, and my apologies if I've mispronounced that. Notes that families and community participation is key, but we need to learn how to do it effectively. We tend to engage in a one-way communication when working with families and communities requires a lot of back and forth. We're doing a lot of talking, but not so much listening or learning. How can we achieve more effective participation? Maria Radini notes that she's interested to hear that capacity development was identified as an opportunity to move out of silos and to work in a more integrated manner. Is there a specific program that is a good example of the integration across sectors? And finally, again, Jane Lewick-Yuzuka, who enjoys your voice, as we all do, notes that your measures of success slides are more themes for which indicators and measures would be identified. Is there consensus around priorities within the themes that would guide the opportunities and the paths that you laid out? And take 10 or 15 minutes, and we are going over an hour here, and people are, of course, welcome to leave the webinar at any point, and it will be recorded if you want to come back and hear how Cassie answers these thought-provoking questions. Last round, Cassie, over to you.
Thank you, Mark. I have to say I was listening more than taking notes as you were giving me these last, wondering whether they were going to be closing comments from your side. So I may need a little reminder as to all of them, but perhaps I'll just take a couple. The notion of which ministry is involved here, I think we've gone around this in many ways in the early childhood field. There's some very interesting work that's been done by Emily Vargas Barón, which is approaching really the sort of the similar to what the child prevention mapping has done, but going into a country and as a first step, bringing together a coordinated high-level commission with representatives from across the different sectors that are involved in trying to identify what would be the responsibilities along this continuum of child development. So I think in some ways, instead of trying to fight against the fact that at country level this work cuts across sectors, would be to forming partnerships with the different agencies that are responsible and using a language that finds, not trying to add on another set of responsibilities or things that ministries and or providers working at the community level need to do, but it's more in a way of what does the child development perspective do that can enhance what it is that you're already doing. So for 0 to 3, what is it about the notions of developmental milestones, notions of key things about parenting that would enhance the health status of children? So it's not seen as a competitive, but it's really coming in as a complement to what's already happening. And I see, actually, it may not be across the board, and maybe we need to start working with those who are most interested in expanding their paradigms, because I have to say, from my experience, I think there's in the last few years, there's a tremendous interest from the pediatric community, from the health sectors, who have moved beyond survival to look at what are some of the developmental and behavioral challenges that our families are confronting. So instead of working against or trying to bring all of these together under one framework, I think perhaps it's working within the existing roles and responsibilities that various ministries and agencies have, but enhancing the quality of the services that they're providing and coming up with a framework, whether it's a Special Child's Commission, whether it's one of the key lead ministries that has the capacity or the interest to see linkages. So what happens after a child turns 3? If you do move it over then to the education ministry, where's the shared framework there? What insights can be given to the education sector, or where can they find linkages between feeding programs in preschools or health programs that can be delivered through a preschool program. So it's really finding the entry points rather than trying to change the structure. It's working within a structure and finding those notions or those opportunities to build linkages. And I feel optimistic that while we are stuck, I think it's moving, and perhaps from those countries who want to move, who are rethinking some of the ways they provide services, some of the countries in Latin America that are perhaps looking at national programs, we can begin to have platforms. This goes again down to we need some space, I think, where we can begin to share some of these lessons of success across different countries. So I'm not sure if that is exactly what you were looking for. Mark, remind me again where I should go next with this.
Well, there were several questions about examples of, well, first of all, examples of effective parenting programs that address violence reduction. And I think as we post this, this is something that Cassie and I have been discussing bilaterally recently as well for some joint programs we're hoping to design. There's a lot out there, and we can point the way to some of it on the website that will summarize this webinar. But considering the governance and budget issues, this is a new question, but that I think reflects some of the questions that we've had. You know, where would you situate in a parenting program, and what would it look like to make it scalable? What are some parenting education strategies and websites or places we might look for that? And then we also had the question about the priorities among the various themes of measures and successes.
Oh, yes. Okay, maybe I'll just take that last one first. Sorry that I was a little negligent when you asked me those before. I think that's a very interesting question, and the answer is we haven't prioritized within either my final 5 points recommendations or the benchmarks that were identified through the interviews with a whole range of different experts looking across the violence prevention and early childhood. But I think that perhaps is something for those of us to consider. Maybe it's the first task of putting together some sort of global platform. This actually, I should say, is the first time I've, besides a very brief presentation, this is the first time that this work has been launched, so to speak. But I think in your question is perhaps a next action point, that it would be interesting to pull together a group of thinkers and certainly bring in some donors as well to the discussion. How would we prioritize? And given this whole list of exciting things that are going on, what could we as a collective group perhaps prioritize? Maybe one of if we look across those 5 areas, we could identify 1 or 2 key action points that we would want to organize ourselves in and begin to focus on. Some of them are going to be able to be done much quicker than others. Some of those information packages, I think, where we pull together some of the strategies for key messaging that we could insert into relevant on networks I think we could easily create an opportunity for that, pull together some working groups who would be interested in creating these packages. I also think we know quite a bit now about some of to how we could enrich some of the ongoing campaigns with a new way of messaging. In terms of parenting education, I should say that what this document is all about is lists and lists and lists and tables. It has a wide annex of programs that I found interesting, and there are links to each of those programs under each of those 7 initiatives that I mentioned. So there's a section on tools, there's a section on parenting education programs, there's links to some of the work that's been done, very important work by WHO to do systematic review of evidence-based parenting programs. So this report was not an effort necessarily to summarize that, but to identify what's out there in terms of accesses. So it links to some very specific programs as well as to some of the reports and documents. I think there are maybe 8 different examples of tools and measures that there's the UNICEF one, there's a UNESCO initiative there, there's a tool listed from Save the Children, there's another regional tool from Latin America, something called the Early Development Index, which is a community-based, looking not at individual children, but looking at how well communities are doing in terms of outcomes, child development outcomes at age 5. So I think for those of you who want to delve into some of these issues a little bit more deeply, I hope that this will provide some resources, and by all means, you're welcome to contact me if you have any questions about the documents or the links listed there. Gosh, Mark, am I doing okay with my response? I do want to say something about parenting, which I neglected, and I think this perhaps is another action point for where we could start. The field of parenting education is replete with different types of models. As I mentioned, some are community-based, working with groups. Some are video, where it's just a media-based program followed up by some face-to-face kind of encounters for families who need more. Some of these are highly evaluated, others are not. But I think within the overlap, there's a few key areas that we could focus on. One is parenting education programs for children with disabilities. That seems to be a very strong gap in the early childhood field. Again, this is another one of those issues that falls between sectors. Sometimes it's its own sector, but I know child protection field has also been looking at children with disabilities, and we know that this is a very vulnerable population. So that's perhaps a very specific area where our 2 fields of expertise could come together. The other that has emerged loud and clear would be programs for involvement of fathers. What I found so fascinating about this is 10 years ago when we talked about early child development, the notion of involving fathers was sort of wasn't an afterthought, but we knew that it wasn't the kind of thing that would really grab the attention. But now it's really quite fascinating to see that there's special websites, there's special initiatives which are just involvement of fathers, and I think that's another area where we could bring our 2 expertise together. The third is the whole area of marginalized populations. I'm involved now with a Open Society Foundation in trying to develop a 0 to 3 parenting education program for Roma families. And again, while you would take some of the core ideas about what makes a successful program, working with Roma populations, as with other special populations, would need to be adapted and adjusted. So I think that's another, highlighting marginalized populations is another left out area where our fields could merge. The fourth one, which I'll mention, and perhaps is bringing in another sector, which is this notion of social protection and conditional cash transfers. There's oftentimes the early childhood field and has perhaps not been seen as strongly. So I think perhaps parenting education programs as a component of conditional cash transfers could also be another way for our fields to go. So while there's many players in the field of parenting education, it's whoever has access to reaching families. I think these four key areas highlight gaps where would be ripe for collaboration and some new thinking amongst our two set of experts here.
Thank you, Cassie. That's a lot of food for thought. And I think what emerges most strongly from me from all of these questions and from your presentation and your research is that we're at the beginning of a process and not well into it, and that we have a lot that we can explore as sectors and as different communities, but also perhaps we need to take our hats off a bit and think about this more holistically. And I think that's it becomes easier to do the closer that you get to children themselves. And I think your point about starting with extremely marginalized children is a good one, because there is, this is a group where, marginalizations and various forms of vulnerability are cross-cutting and cross a number of issues and themes, and these are children that we know are in very serious need of services, and so it's a good place to start. I'm going to end with a comment here from Jane Luwikizuka in Uganda, who emphasizes the role of leadership, and this was a thought that I had as you were talking as well. She says, I would emphasize the role of leadership, political, donor, and otherwise, in making cross-sectoral work happen. In Uganda, engaging sectoral ministries in violence against children and child protection studying and strategizing is extremely difficult, particularly due to the limited influence of the Ministry of Gender, Labor, and Social Development, where these issues are generally housed. And I think as I listened to you, one of the thoughts I had was that actually we are going to need to look for ways to galvanize leadership at very high levels to make this happen. Any final thoughts on that issue? And then we will close the webinar.
I think that's actually it. Thank you, Jane, for your comments and for all of your comments. Those of you who have written in, they're very insightful. But I do think this is a nice, an important point to end on. I do think leadership is key. Leadership both within countries on a national level, but also at some of the agencies with which we work, to find leadership within our organizations. I do think there is an emerging platform of donors who are recognizing this area. So while there's a small but growing field of highly vocal and visible leaders that I think we need to tap into, and that it goes without saying that without strong leadership to galvanize and pull together this very complex but critical field is going to be as an important priority. Perhaps along with the global platform, we can identify some key leaders that may want to spearhead that along with us. So it's leadership in terms of the next generation with the skills and capacities to be leaders within their country, the responsibility for that lying within our training graduate schools, but then also tapping into our current leaders to finding which one of those can be champions for the integration of early child development and violence, abuse, and neglect prevention. So thank you all for your attention, and I hope we find ourselves at a similar meeting or same meeting at one point along the next year or so. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Cassie, and I hope that everyone else has a great day or afternoon or evening. Thanks very much, all.